Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace. If you ever pass through Falkirk in Scotland, you'd be hard-pressed to miss catching a glimpse of the Kelpies. Standing at 30 metres, or 98 feet high, these glistening horse heads are the largest equine sculptures in the world and serve as a monument to Scotland's horse-powered industrial heritage. In Scottish folklore, however, the Kelpies, also known in Gaelic as Yachushka, are the most dangerous of Scotland's mythological creatures. There's an old story from Orkney about some young boys who encountered a Kelpie one day whilst playing along the shoreline. It was a brisk, cold morning, and the Har was hiding the slowly intruding seafront from the wee lads who blissfully chased one another along the damp sand, following only the slapping sounds of their fellows' footsteps. As they ran further along the shoreline, one boy cried out about a beastie glowing in the distance and pointed to the silver outline shimmering in the sea. The boys slowed to a halt and watched what appeared to be a silver horse treading water, its mane and tail radiating a warm light that pushed the Har away from it. Eager to examine the creature, the boys ran towards it, not caring that they needed to wade ankle-deep into the icy sea to meet the creature. The horse lowered its head and body and welcomed the boys to stroke its neck, and encouraged by its tame nature, several of them climbed onto its back. But the boys who tried to remove their hands from the creature found themselves stuck. Their hands were magnetized to its body, unable to leave its surface. Those on its back tried to swing their legs off, but their limbs held on tight. Each boy began to panic, and one, who had only shyly pet its nose, realised the severity of their situation. Thinking quickly, he whipped out his skian-dhu and cut off his hand, which was touching the horse. Just as he freed himself, the horse raised up and, snorting fire and brimstone from its nostrils, leapt away from the single-handed boy and rode off into the sea, pulling all the other boys with him. The wee lad watched in horror as his screaming and panicking friends got pulled beneath the surface of the icy water with the horse, never to be seen again. The Kelpie was a monster belonging to Satan. It could take on any shape, though it was largely known to appear as a horse who falsely enticed innocent or lost travellers to mount its back, and then pull them beneath the surface of a loch where they would devour them. There were tales of how Kelpies appeared as handsome young men to women, who would entice them to lie with them in the heather, only transforming into his true self when she fell asleep, and then, wrapping his seaweed-like mane around her, he would drag her away into the waters and devour her. Kelpies also appeared as beautiful women who enticed others near the water, where they would sweep their allured victim into their watery grave. In fact, many folklorists believe that the Loch Ness monster is a mutation of a Kelpie story, whose myth has morphed over time. Sightings of Nessie, the Loch Ness monster, have reportedly occurred since the 6th century, with the first recorded sighting of the monster occurring nearly 1,500 years ago in 565 CE. It is said that an Irish monk, Saint Columba, was staying with some friends when he came across the locals burying a man by the river Ness. They explained that the man had been swimming in the river when he was attacked by a water beast that had mauled him and dragged him under. Columba then sent one of his followers to swim across the river, and lo and behold, the beast came for him too. Columba made a sign of the cross and commanded that the beast not touch the man and go back at once. The creature halted and retreated, and the Picts praised God for the miracle. Situated in the Great Glen of Scotland, the Loch Ness is a 24 miles long, up to 1.5 miles wide, and over 700 feet deep for the most of its length, and almost completely surrounded by forests. It is longer than the English Channel at Dover and is 4 times as deep as a channel at its deepest, and it's never been known to freeze over. Sightings of Nessie increased in 1933 due to the widening of the nearby road, the A82, along the northern side of the loch. The blasting necessary for the road's construction sent shockwaves along the length and breadth of the loch and agitated the wildlife into unusual outbursts of activity, including, apparently, Nessie. In the issue of The Slasher for February 1959, there is the following account. It seems that the monster made its most recent appearance just before Christmas. It should be stated that a forestry interest emerges because the men who saw it were, at the time, returning to Inverness with a 35-foot Christmas tree. It is reported that after seeing a considerable disturbance of the surface of the loch beyond Urquhart Castle, that they saw 3 distinct humps, which seemed unmistakably those of a species of a giant sea serpent. In April 1964, the same journal stated, 3 of our workers claimed to have seen it at any one and the same time. It is reported that, for several minutes after there had been a rock-blasting explosion in the locality, Nessie was spotted and kept under observation. First of all, a large black object was seen to break the surface and cruise towards the opposite shore. It turned suddenly and, moving at around 25 miles per hour, went parallel to the shore, causing a great wash. Then it lay still on the surface for some seconds, before sinking slowly out of sight. It is said that a storm-away fishing boat in the vicinity at the time recorded a strange object showing on the chart of being at 40 fathoms and 30 feet long. A Ness fisheries representative estimated that every year since 1933 there had been 20 to 30 sightings reported of a creature that he would regard as genuine. The reports accepted as genuine and inexplicable by the Loch Ness Phenomena Investigation Bureau since 1936 have been 40 sightings in 1963, 18 in 1964, 9 in 1965 and 29 in 1966. According to the record in a book by Anthony Brown in 1971, the whiskey producer Cutty Sark offered an award of £1 million for the capture of the monster assumed to exist in the Loch Ness. However, someone higher up in Cutty Sark Company clearly believed in the likelihood of a future payout and got cold feet, so they approached Lloyd's in London to cover a risk for a premium of £2,500. The insurance contract, as produced in Brown's book, specifies that the risk is covered only if the monster is captured alive between the 1st of May 1971 and the 30th of April 1972. Further, the slip says, quote, "As far as this insurance is concerned, the Loch Ness monster shall be deemed to be 1. In excess of 20 feet in length, 2. Acceptable as the Loch Ness monster to the creators of the Natural History Museum, London." Nessie is the longest-serving Scottish myth that has blended into reality. Over time, the Kelpie became associated with dinosaurs, more specifically plesiosaur, and to this day it is seen more as a reptile than a demonic seahorse. But before we get more into folklore discussions in Scotland and other sea monsters, I'd like to take a quick moment to thank today's sponsor, Squarespace. I have built all of my main business websites over the past few years with Squarespace because I love how intuitive and easy it makes website design and layout. You see, I don't know anything about coding, which has made using other website platforms incredibly frustrating. But with Squarespace, I can simply drag and drop my content where I want it. I mean, if you're a creator who wants to expand your revenue stream, Squarespace is an all-in-one platform that makes it easy for you to monetize your content and expertise in a way that suits your brand. Squarespace member areas lets you sell your courses or classes to followers, and Squarespace has also got an inbuilt email campaign option where you can collect email subscribers and convert them into loyal customers, all from your website. And the built-in analytics feature gives you insight into who's visiting your site, traffic sources, time spent on your site, most read content, audience geography, and so much more. So whether you're looking to expand your business in the new year or just build a beautiful website for your new blog in 2023, Then head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Lady of the Library to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you Squarespace for sponsoring today's video, and now let's discuss more about Scottish folklore. We owe much to many local folklorists for the preservation of Scotland's folklore. John Francis Campbell of Islay, John Lorne Campbell of Canna, John Gregorson Campbell, Walter Gregor, Margaret Fay Shaw and Jeanette Henderson of Wick were all crucial in documenting and preserving the fragile and nearly eradicated stories of Scotland's Gaelic culture. But on top of the fragility of its historical documentation, discussing folklore in Scotland isn't straightforward. As James Porter emphasises in his work, folklorists are always grappling with changing notions of folklore, ethnology, folk life, material culture and oral tradition, and key words such as tradition and performance, which don't overlay well, if at all, into contemporary folklore, particularly in northern Scotland. Porter argues that folklore is more than the product of a communal imagination, and it's intimately related to power relations in society, economic factors, public institutions and academic disciplines due to population shifts. Whilst many traditionalists treat folklore as though it were a historical source that requires maintenance in order to survive and be neatly preserved, Porter argues that folklore is more than a historical document. It's a product of cultural continuity and an emergent feature of everyday life. Creatures baleful and benign have haunted every inch of the Scottish wilderness for centuries, and stories about them have persisted despite the persecution of the Protestant Church and educational authorities attempting to rid the land of Gaelic traditions and language. The supernatural played a huge role in the formation of local identity of the coasts, islands and highlands of Scotland. The power of water in Scottish folklore presents both a supernatural threat and defence. For example, the Orkney Islands are a group of more than 70 islands and islets in Scotland, lying around 20 miles or 32 kilometres north of the Scottish mainland, across the strait known as the Pentland Firth. Only about 20 of them are inhabited, and thus the water around them outscales the small society. The sea, lochs and rivers are watery frontiers which exemplify the many borders of the small Scottish societies, between civilization and the supernatural, the everyday and the otherworldly. Water, much like forests, glens, lochs and woodlands, are symbolic of frontiers, metaphysical zones dividing the mythical from the mundane. But the shore as a border for the supernatural and cultural tensions isn't a unique feature of Scottish folklore, as globally speaking, borders have been historically fraught with anxiety, from invaders in the ancient world to politically charged discussions about migrants, asylum seekers and victims of war today. However, the 19th century supernatural folklore of Scotland associated with watery frontiers demonstrated the fundamental struggle for the locals to define their identity and power against threatening forces. The history of the Highlands is steeped in suffering of capitalism's victims. In 1750, a third of Scotland's population still lived north of the Highland line. Today, it's just around 5%. In the last 270 years, more than 250,000 Indigenous Scots were forced off their ancestral lands, burned out of their homes, sold into slavery, and forcibly assimilated into foreign culture. In the 17th century, England tried to conquer Scotland, but the Highland Scots opposed the annexation of their homeland and supported Charles Edward Stuart as the true King of Scotland. Calling themselves the Jacobites after their former king, the Highlanders rebelled. At Culloden Field on the 16th of April 1746, the English army crushed the Scottish rebellion, and the Highlanders were massacred. When the battle was over, the Highland lairds were dead, and the English set out to destroy the clans once and for all. In 1747, England passed the Act of Prescription, which banned Scots from wearing tartan, playing the bagpipes, the right to own weapons, gathering clans, and, importantly, teaching Gaelic. Those who broke this law faced 7 years of slavery in an overseas English colony. Another law that same year turned all clan lands over to the English crown. In 40 years, the clan culture was largely destroyed, and the Gaelic culture in Scotland began to die out. Between the mid-18th and mid-19th century, many inhabitants of the Highlands and Westland Islands were forcibly evicted from their homes, in an event which was later known as the Highland Clearances. The first phase took place between 1760 and 1815, and that started with the dismantling of traditional townships known as Beltien, by replacing them with individual crofts, which shared access to common grazing for animals. The people who had previously lived on the shared farms were moved to the coast, and the properties they previously lived and worked in were turned into large holdings for sheep. The second phase took place between 1815 and 1820 and continued until the 1850s. During this time, landlords forcibly removed people from their estates. Many Highlanders' homes were burned down, particularly in Sutherland. One local, Donald MacLeod, at the time reported that he saw 250 homes from one district ablaze, with fires lasting 6 days. However, Patrick Seller, the factor for the Countess, later Duchess of Sutherland, was acquitted on charges of arson and culpable homicide. The clearances had a profound impact on the cultural landscape of Scotland's Highlands, which became one of the most sparsely populated areas in the whole of Europe. It's thought that in 1755, 51% of the Scottish population lived in the Highlands, but by 1981 that had fallen to just 21%, and today it is around 5%. It's believed that 150,000 Highlanders and Islanders were cleared from their lands during the entire period of the clearances, which had an impact on the economic prosperity of the Highland region. Additionally, the Crofters Act didn't break up the large estates owned by wealthy landlords, meaning that to this day, the Scottish Highlands has an unequal distribution of land. More than half the country is owned by fewer than 500 people. This is why, on a wee bit of a tangent, that I refuse to be sponsored by any of these fake Scottish title companies, such as Established Titles or Highland Titles, etc. People who I've been seeing all over YouTube are sponsored by them, and they have reached out to me on several occasions. These companies that offer you to buy a plot of Scottish land in exchange for a fake lord or lady title under the guise that it's all good fun and beneficial for the environment of Scotland are a contemporary byproduct of the horrific massacres of Highlanders hundreds of years ago. These companies don't care about the cultural sensitivity of land ownership in Scotland, and the purchase of mass souvenir plots under the greenwashing guise of conservation only perpetuates the hundreds of year-old exploitation and dismissive mistreatment of Scotland and its people. Anyway, mini rant over. Let's return to look at yet another mythical Scottish being, whose stories likely also originated in the Highlands, the Selkie. Selkie is a word for seal in northern Scotland, but they aren't any old seal. You see, the common seal is known as a tangfish, and they haven't got the same metamorphosing powers as Selkies, which are the names for the Great Greenland seals. In Faroese and Scottish mythology, Selkies, or Silkies, are seals who can take on human form when they take their sealskin off. How Selkies came to be in existence varies from story to story. In some folklore, Selkies are fallen angels, in others they're humans who were condemned to take the form of a seal, and in others they are actually women who drowned out at sea. Much like the Kelpies, Selkies also form relationships with humans, but not in such a sinister fashion. Male Selkies are often described as having illicit love affairs with married women, when in human form of course, and female Selkies in folklore are often tricked into marrying human men, when a man takes the opportunity to steal her sealskin when she comes to the beach during the full moon to dance at night. Charles Temple gathered sources together to come up with a sort of Selkie story, which reads as follows. The 7-year-old boy of an ageing fishing couple living on the north coast of Scotland was poking around on the shore in the dusky daylight of a midsummer night. We'll call him Ivan, because that's the equivalent of Jack in many parts of Eastern Europe. One day, Ivan heard what may have been singing, and looking down the coast, saw what might have been smoke coming from a cave. He didn't do any exploring at that time. The story doesn't explain why. Perhaps his young legs were too short to carry him across the boulders that lay between him and the cave. Exactly 7 years later, Ivan was down on the coast at midnight on a midsummer night. He heard the singing and saw the smoke. Again, Ivan didn't explore, and once again the story doesn't explain why. Perhaps his parents called him inside. But the third time, another 7 years later, Ivan was 21 and living alone in a cottage by the sea, having taken over his late father's trade. His mother had moved away to live with relatives. At midnight on a midsummer's night, Ivan walked down the shore. He heard the singing and saw the smoke, and this time he made his way down the beach to the mouth of the cave. There he found a stack of beautiful seal furs. Peeking carefully inside the cave, he saw a circle of beautiful young women holding hands around a fire and singing a lovely melody of unearthly words. Ivan slipped the sleekest fur from the pile and made his way back to the cottage, where he locked the sealskin in a trunk and hid it under the bed. He tied the key to a leather thong and hung it around his neck. In the morning, he took a blanket and returned to the cave, and there he found a young woman, naked and shivering. He wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and led her home to his cottage, and she stayed a day and a week, a month and a year, and then longer. In time they had a son, and soon after a daughter. Ivan was a happy man, but the woman, you couldn't be so sure. She was sometimes found staring sadly out to sea, especially at those times when a pod of seals swam by with bright, sad eyes. Ivan never told his wife what was in the trunk, or why he kept a key around his neck. Christmas Eve came, and the family went off to church, except for the wife, who complained of an illness. Ivan left his key hanging on the bedstead. When he and the children returned, they found the door swung wide, the trunk open, and the house empty. After that, a beautiful seal with big sad eyes sometimes swam along close offshore when the children walked along the beach, and the beautiful seal with big sad eyes, perhaps the same one, sometimes appeared to steer fish into Ivan's net. Maybe the seal was his wife. All we know for sure is that the woman was never seen on Earth again. The interesting origins of the Selkie myth lie in a medical misreading of physiological conditions. You see, when children were born with what was socially perceived as abnormalities, it was common for folk to blame fairies and the workings of the supernatural for their child's way of being, and the clan McGregor of the Seals was no exception. The McGregors believed that they were descendants of a union between a human and a Selkie, because they had what we now know today as syndactyly, a hereditary growth of skin between their fingers that made their hands resemble flippers. Another possibility behind the origins of the Selkie is actually explained by Scottish folklorist and antiquarian David McGregor, who believed that early settlers in Scotland probably encountered and even married Finnish and Sami women who were misidentified as Selkies because of their sealskin kayaks and clothing. You see, both the clothes and the kayaks would lose buoyancy when saturated with water and would therefore need drying out. Therefore, it is thought that sightings of Inuit women divesting themselves of their clothing or lying next to their skin-like clothing on the rocks would have led to the belief in an ability to change from a seal to a woman, and vice versa. As Harris says, the various manifestations of anxieties and uncertainties in the 19th century Scottish water law express a regional and historical representation of storytelling. This law exemplifies the difficulty of containing the conflicting supernaturalism of a folkloric tradition that encodes a collective growing consciousness of the beautiful dangers of water as a life-giving and death-dealing element. Scottish people, especially the Highlanders, found themselves identifying with their environments, and when looking out at that which surrounded their entire existence, they couldn't help but see their deepest fears and desires of their subconsciousness reflected back at them. The sea was their home and their frontier. It embraced them, battered them, cared for them, and frightened them. For land-bound Scots, the sea and water represented the edge of the world for them. Many never saw beyond the confines of the small island they occupied for their entire lives, so what lay beyond it and beneath it was both alluring and frightening. But after hundreds of years of erasure, they found strength in their joint identity with water, the water that enfolded their homeland, and with it, they birthed an enduring folklore which still stands strong today. So much so that their folklore has infiltrated global consciousness and mainstream media, as demonstrated by Nessie. After all, not even the most unimaginative skeptic can pass Loch Ness without taking a few minutes to look out onto the vast body of water and watch its surface for a rumbling of something unknown, just in case. Thank you so much for listening and watching today's video. My name is Chinsia, and this video is brought to you by Squarespace. Thank you so much, Squarespace, for sponsoring, and my lovely Patreons. I really appreciate your support. As you can see, I am not on screen at the moment. I am messing around with my camera. I don't know what's wrong with it. I turn off autofocus. It still autofocuses. I don't know what's going on, but I appreciate your patience until then. Hopefully this actually allows me to produce more content at a faster pace though, so we'll see as it goes along, but I will be doing a video format over on my Patreon with those who don't mind the in and out filtering of the camera autofocus, so watch out for that. I hope you have a wonderful day, and remember, books save lives, so keep reading.